I still have the shirt in a box under my bed. Black cotton, thin from washing, collar worn soft. It doesn't smell like him anymore. Just cedar and 40 years of sitting still. But when I hold it up to the window, I'm back in that dressing room, watching John thread a needle with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, trying to fix a split seam before he went on. He looked up at me and said something I didn't understand then. He said he'd wear black until things were brighter. And he said it like a man signing a contract he knew he couldn't break. I need to tell you what that really meant, because the story everyone knows, the one from the song. The one about prisoners and the poor, that's true, but it's not complete. Here's what I've carried since April 2003, when we put him in the ground. Was the black for the world's suffering, or was it for his own? And if it was for his own, what was he mourning that he never named? I was a session guitarist, mostly. I worked the Nashville circuit in the late 60s, early 70s, played on a few of John's records, toured with him twice. I wasn't inner circle, but I was close enough to see things. Close enough that he'd talk to me in the margins, between takes, in hotel hallways at 2 in the morning when neither of us could sleep. Right now, I'm 78 years old, sitting in a house in East Tennessee with that shirt in my lap. My daughter thinks I should donate it to a museum. She doesn't understand that some things aren't artifacts, they're evidence. And the truth matters now because John's been gone more than 20 years, and the legend has calcified into something clean and easy, and he was never either of those things. So let me sharpen the question for you. If wearing black was a vow, what was he atoning for that the song never said? It was November 1971, I think, maybe early 72. We were at Columbia Studio B in Nashville. Cold night, the kind where the air has edges. I got there early because I wanted to run through the arrangement alone, and when I walked in, John was already there, sitting on a folding chair in the corner, still in his coat. Black coat, black shirt, black boots. The only light in the room was a single work lamp someone had left on, and it made his shadow stretch all the way to the back wall. I said something about the cold. He didn't answer right away. He was holding a small photograph, the size of a wallet card, and he was looking at it the way you look at something you've looked at 1,000 times and still can't understand. I asked if he was all right, and he tucked the photograph back into his shirt pocket and said, "Fine, just thinking about the set list." But his hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. I sat down with my guitar and pretended to tune it, giving him space, but I was watching him in the glass of the control room window. He stood up, took off the coat, and that's when I saw the seam under his left arm had split, white thread hanging loose. He asked if I had a sewing kit. I did. I always carried one on the road. I handed it to him, and he sat back down and started working the needle through the fabric, but his hands wouldn't steady. He kept missing the hole, jabbing his thumb, and after the third time he stopped and just sat there with the needle in one hand and the shirt bunched in the other. That's when he said it. He said, "I'll wear this until things are brighter." I thought he meant the shirt. I didn't know he meant all of it. Have you ever made a promise to someone that you kept, even after they couldn't hear you anymore? If you have, I'd like to know if you think that's love or just refusal to let go. Drop a comment and tell me, because I've been trying to figure out the difference for 50 years. I didn't ask him what he meant that night. You didn't push John when he was in that place. But the question stayed with me, because a week later, he wore the same black clothes on stage. And a month later, and a year later, and every time I saw him for the next 30 years. The black became the story everyone told, the one he told, the one in the song. But I kept thinking about that photograph he wouldn't show me. The thing about memory is that it betrays you in two directions. You forget the details that matter, and you remember the ones that don't. I can't tell you the exact date of that night in the studio, and I can't tell you what song we were rehearsing, but I can tell you the seam was under his left arm, and I can tell you the thread was white, and I can tell you his thumb bled a little, and he wiped it on his jeans, which were also black. What I can verify, because it's in the record, is that John wore black publicly starting in the late 50s, and he recorded Men in Black in 1971. And he gave a dozen interviews where he explained it as solidarity with the forgotten. And all of that is true. But what I'm telling you is that there was another layer, something private, that he carried parallel to the public story. I know because I asked him about it once, years later, and he didn't deny it. He just said, "Some things you wear on the outside because you can't carry them on the inside anymore." Now here's where the timelines start to braid, because after that night in the studio, I started noticing when the black seemed heavier on him. It wasn't constant. There were months, sometimes years, where he wore it like a uniform, professional, no weight to it. But there were other times, and I'll tell you about one in a minute, where it looked like it was the only thing holding him together. In 1988, I ran into him at a benefit concert in Memphis. I hadn't seen him in a few years. He looked older, thinner, but still in black, head to toe. We had about 10 minutes backstage before he went on. And I asked him, maybe because I was older too and less afraid of the answer, I asked him if he'd ever thought about wearing something else. Just once. Just to see. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He said, "I made a deal." I said, "With who?" And he said, "With myself." And then he said, "I'll tell you the rest someday, but not today." That someday never came, not directly. But I pieced it together from things he said in pieces. From things June said after he died. From that photograph I finally saw years later, in a documentary, and recognized. It was a picture of his brother, Jack, who died when John was 12. In a table saw accident that John wasn't there to prevent because he'd gone fishing instead. Here's where I need you to stay with me, because this is the part that reframes everything. John talked about Jack publicly, many times. He talked about the guilt, the loss, the way it shaped him. But what he didn't talk about, what I think he couldn't talk about, was the promise he made at 12 years old, standing at his brother's grave, that he would live seriously enough for both of them, that he would never take brightness lightly, that he would dress like a man in mourning until the world, or his own heart, could hold light again. And here's the thing. That day never came for him. Things got better. He got sober. He had June. He had his kids. He had the music. But the mourning didn't lift it. He wore the black at his wedding, at his concerts, at the grocery store, in the hospital. He wore it the last time I saw him, in 2002, when he could barely walk and his voice was almost gone. I asked him, "John, are things brighter yet?" And he shook his head. "Not yet," he said. "Not yet. If you want to hear more stories like this, ones that get close to the room where the truth lived, hit subscribe. Because what I'm about to tell you next is the moment I understood that the black wasn't a symbol. It was a skin. And once you put it on for the right reasons or the wrong ones, you can't take it off without losing the part of yourself that made the promise in the first place. Stay with me. The official story, the one from Man in Black, says he wore it for the poor, the prisoners, the hungry, the lonely. And I believe he meant every word of that. But I also believe that when he wrote that song, he was building a cathedral around a private grave. He was taking his own mourning and making it big enough to include everyone else's, so he wouldn't have to explain the 12-year-old boy who never stopped apologizing to his brother. June told me once, a few years after John died, that he used to have nightmares where Jack would come to him and ask why John was still alive. And he wasn't. And in the dream, John could never answer. He'd just stand there, and Jack would fade, and John would wake up and put on black again, like it was armor or penance or both. I asked her if she ever tried to get him to wear something else, just around the house. Just once. She said she did, early on. She bought him a blue shirt once, soft chambray, thinking maybe if he wore it just for breakfast, just for an hour, it might crack something open. He thanked her, folded it, put it in a drawer, and never touched it again. She never bought him another color. Here's what I remember about the last time I saw him. It was a small gathering, just a few old friends, at his house in Hendersonville. He was in a wheelchair by then, oxygen line running to his nose, but he was still in black. Black sweater, black pants, black socks. I sat next to him for a while and we didn't talk much, just watched the lake through the window. The light was soft, late afternoon, golden. And I thought, this is bright. This moment is bright. But I looked at him, and I knew he couldn't see it that way. I finally asked him, and maybe I shouldn't have, but I asked him if he regretted the vow. If he wished he'd let himself off the hook, just once, just at the end. He turned his head, slow, and looked at me with those deep-set eyes, and he said, "You don't get promise just because it gets hard. You break it when the reason for it is gone. And the reason's not gone." I asked him what the reason was exactly, and he said, "I'm still here and Jack's not. That's the reason. That's the whole reason." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just sat with him. And a few minutes later he said, "When things are brighter, I'll change. But they won't be. Not for me. Maybe for someone else. Maybe that's enough." So here's the answer to the question I asked you at the beginning. The black was for the world, yes. But it was also for Jackie. It was for the boy who didn't get to grow up, and for the boy who did and never forgave himself for it. It was a vow that was both public and private, both symbol and cage. And John wore it until the day he died, because to take it off would have been to say that things were brighter, and he couldn't lie about that. Not even to himself. What that means, what it should mean to you, is that when you hear Man in Black now, when you see those old photos of him on stage, unsmiling, shoulders square, you're not just looking at a protest or a brand. You're looking at a man keeping a promise to a ghost. You're looking at mourning that never ended because the love that fed it never ended. And maybe that's the truth about all of us who make vows we can't keep. We wear them until we can't anymore. And if we're lucky, someone remembers why we put them on in the first place. Here's what I need from you now, if you've stayed with me this long. First, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I've got more stories like this. Stories about the people behind the songs you think you know. And I'm not done telling them. Second, leave a comment and tell me about a promise you've kept longer than you thought you could. What are you still wearing, literally or otherwise, because you made a vow you won't break? I want to know. And third, if this story meant something to you, if it changed the way you hear that song, hit the super like. That's what keeps these stories alive. That's what lets me keep digging into the truth, the kind that doesn't make it into the liner notes. John's gone now. June's gone. Jack's been gone since 1944. But the black remains in every photograph, every recording, every memory. And now you know it wasn't just a costume. It was a vow. A vow he kept until things were brighter, which for him meant never. And maybe that's not tragic. Maybe that's just love that wouldn't quit, even when it hurt. Maybe that's the only kind of love that matters.